The stale scent of hay, sweat, and old leather filled the air inside the crowded auction barn. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of ranchers, traders, and gamblers, their faces shadowed beneath well-worn cowboy hats. The auctioneer's voice rang out like a hammer against steel, rattling off numbers as thoroughbreds were paraded through the arena. Each horse had a price, a future. Some were destined for glory on the racetrack. Others would spend their days pulling plows or carrying riders across endless plains. But then there were those who had no future at all. A bay thoroughbred was led into the ring, his ribs barely concealed beneath a dull, dusty coat. He moved with hesitation, his head slightly lowered as if already aware of what was coming. Scars laced his legs, remnants of races he had never won. Once bred for speed, for power, for victory. Now, he was nothing but a forgotten name on a discarded betting slip. The auctioneer cleared his throat and forced a smile. Here's a fine thoroughbred, gentlemen. Good bloodline, but luck wasn't on his side. Who'll start the bidding? Silence. A few men shifted in their seats, unimpressed. A rancher in a faded denim jacket leaned toward his neighbor and muttered, "That one's got nothing left in him." His friend chuckled, spitting tobacco into an old coffee can. "Not even worth the feed. He's dog meat." The auctioneer exhaled sharply, already knowing how this would end. He glanced at the back of the barn, where buyers for the slaughterhouses waited in silence, arms crossed, ready to claim what no one else wanted. His voice dropped slightly, making it clear that this was the last call. "No bids? Then he's off to the processing lot." A hand went up. "I'll take him." The room fell quiet. Heads turned toward the voice. Luther Graves, a cowboy whose name carried weight in these parts, stood near the railing, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. The murmurs started immediately. "Hell, Graves, you drunk?" someone called out. "What the hell you gonna do with that mess of bones?" another sneered. Luther ignored them. He met the auctioneer's gaze, nodding once. "Sold," the auctioneer said, more surprised than anyone else. The gavel came down. Luther walked to the ring and took hold of the lead rope. The horse didn't flinch, didn't fight. He just stood there, still as death, staring at Luther with dark, searching eyes. And for a moment, just a fleeting second, Luther swore he saw something in them. Not fear, not defeat, something else. Something that sent an uneasy shiver down his spine. And though he didn't know it yet, the choice he had just made would change his life forever. Luther led the horse through the narrow alley behind the auction barn, his boots crunching against the dirt as the murmurs from the crowd faded into the distance. The horse followed without resistance, though his steps were slow, uncertain. Luther glanced at him from the corner of his eye. There was something off about this animal. Not in the way he walked, not even in his scars, but in the way he watched. Quiet, calculating, like he knew more than a damn horse should. By the time they reached the loading area, the last few buyers were settling their deals. Some were leading their new purchases into trailers, bound for sprawling ranches and racetracks. Others weren't so lucky. A separate group of horses was being herded toward the slaughter trucks, their eyes wide, hooves scuffing against the metal ramps. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, manure, and something colder. Something final. A voice cut through the din. "You're full of surprises, Graves." Luther didn't turn immediately. He knew that voice. Merrick Slade. The man was leaning against the side of a rusted-out stock trailer, arms crossed, eyes gleaming with amusement beneath his wide-brimmed hat. He was one of the biggest kill buyers in the state. If there was a horse nobody wanted, Merrick made sure it never went to waste. Luther exhaled, keeping his grip firm on the lead rope. "Didn't know I owed you an explanation, Slade." Merrick chuckled, pushing himself off the trailer with the heel of his boot. "You don't. But I gotta admit, I'm curious. That one was already mine." His grin widened, slow and deliberate. "Tell you what, I'll buy him off you. Hell, I'll even throw in a little extra. Save you the trouble." The horse's ears flicked back. He knew. Luther felt his fingers tighten on the rope before he even made the decision. He didn't trust many things in this world, but something in his gut told him that if he handed this horse over, he'd regret it for the rest of his life. He met Merrick's stare, a battle of wills hanging in the air like a coiled snake. "No deal," Luther said, his voice even. Merrick's grin faltered for just a second before he let out a dry laugh. "Suit yourself, cowboy. But don't come crying when that thing turns out to be more trouble than he's worth." Luther didn't answer. Instead, he gave the lead rope a gentle tug, guiding the horse away toward his truck. He had no idea why he had just turned down that offer. But something told him he had just made an enemy, and that this horse, this nameless, forgotten creature, was about to change everything. The long drive back to the ranch was quiet, too quiet. The hum of the truck's engine filled the cab, but Luther could still feel the presence of the horse in the trailer behind him, shifting only slightly as the wheels bumped along the dirt road. Most horses, especially those fresh from an auction, would be restless, nickering nervously, stomping against the wooden floor of the trailer. But not this one. This horse moved only when necessary, as if he understood the ride wasn't over yet, as if he knew exactly where they were going. And that feeling sat uneasily in Luther's chest like a stone. By the time he pulled up to the ranch, the night had fully settled in, draping the land in an endless stretch of darkness. The barn loomed ahead, its wooden frame barely visible against the night sky. A cold wind rolled over the property, whistling through the fence posts, making the old weather vane above the barn door creak. Luther turned off the truck, but for a moment he didn't move. His hands remained on the wheel, staring out at the trailer in his side mirror. Why did this feel like a mistake? Shaking the thought away, he climbed out of the truck and moved to the back of the trailer, releasing the latch with a sharp metallic click. The ramp dropped, kicking up a small cloud of dust. Inside, the horse stood perfectly still, his dark eyes locked onto Luther's. The moment stretched longer than it should have, like a challenge, like a question neither of them could answer. Then, without hesitation, the horse stepped down. His hooves met the earth with a soft, measured thud, like he had walked this land before. Under the dim barn lights, the horse's coat had an unnatural sheen, smooth and dark, almost too perfect. The scars along his legs stood out more now, thin, jagged reminders of races long lost. Luther led him toward an empty stall, the horse following without resistance. No pulling, no hesitation, just quiet compliance. That should have been a relief, but instead, it unsettled him even more. Most animals took time to trust. This one acted like he already did. Securing the stall door, Luther leaned against the wooden frame, studying the horse. "Guess I should give you a name," he muttered, rubbing his jaw as he considered. He had named dozens of horses before, most after legends, places, or things that meant something to him. But tonight, the word slipped out before he could stop it, like it had been waiting to be spoken. Salem. The horse blinked, slow and deliberate. A gust of wind howled through the barn at that exact moment, rattling the wooden beams, sending a cold shiver down Luther's spine. The lantern above flickered once. Then, the coyotes in the distance, howling just moments ago, went completely silent. Luther didn't believe in bad omens. But as Salem held his gaze, steady and knowing, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he should. Luther lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Normally, sleep came easy after a long day of work, but tonight, something felt different. The ranch was always quiet at this hour, aside from the occasional rustling of the horses or the distant howls of coyotes. But tonight, there was a stillness that made his skin crawl. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel natural, like the land itself was holding its breath. He rolled over, trying to shake the feeling, but his mind kept circling back to the horse. Salem. There was something about him, something unsettling. Luther had worked with hundreds of horses in his lifetime, but none had ever made him feel like this. It wasn't fear, exactly, but it was close. He could still see those dark eyes watching him, still feel that strange weight in his chest when he had spoken the horse's name, like it had always been his name. Then, a sound shattered the silence. A loud bang echoed from outside, followed by the sharp creak of wood. Luther sat up instantly, reaching for the rifle beside his bed. He held his breath, listening. Another noise, hoofbeats. But they weren't the steady, rhythmic steps of a horse moving in its stall. These were erratic, uneven, too heavy. Something was wrong. Throwing on his coat, he stepped outside, the cold night air biting at his skin. The barn stood under the pale moonlight, its doors swaying slightly in the wind. But something wasn't right. The lantern he had left hanging by the entrance was swinging violently, as if someone had shoved it. His gut tightened. He had secured everything before going to bed, hadn't he? With the rifle gripped tight in his hands, Luther pushed open the barn doors. The familiar scent of hay and leather filled the air, but there was something else, something metallic. Blood. His boots crunched against the dirt as he stepped inside, scanning the stalls. Empty. Empty. And then he saw it. Salem's stall was open. The heavy latch that he had locked with his own hands was now hanging loose, the door swaying gently. Luther's pulse pounded in his ears as he took a slow step forward. The stall was empty. Salem was gone. But that wasn't what made Luther's stomach turn. It was the hoofprints, leading out of the barn and into the darkness. They weren't shaped like a horse's at all. Luther stood frozen at the entrance of the stall, his breath slow and measured. His fingers tightened around the rifle, though deep down, he wasn't sure a weapon would do him any good. The hoofprints in the dirt stretched beyond the barn doors, disappearing into the vast darkness of the open field. But something about them made his stomach twist. They were wrong. The impressions were deeper than they should have been, as if whatever had left them was heavier than a normal horse. And the shape, too long, too sharp. Swallowing down the unease rising in his throat, he stepped outside, his boots crunching against the dirt as he followed the tracks. The cold night air pressed against his skin, and the sky above was moonless, leaving the land swallowed in darkness. He should have grabbed a lantern, but something told him light wouldn't help. He could feel it now, that strange weight pressing against his chest, the same feeling he'd had the moment he named the damn horse. He moved carefully, his eyes scanning the land ahead. The tracks led away from the barn, weaving through the open pasture, then toward the tree-line at the edge of the property. Luther had lived on this land his entire life, and he knew it better than anyone. But tonight, as he stared into the shadows between the trees, it felt different, foreign. Like he was standing at the edge of something he wasn't meant to cross. A sudden rustling in the distance made him freeze. His grip on the rifle tightened. The sound was faint, but it was there, something moving in the trees. A shape shifted in the dark, just beyond his sight. His heart pounded. Then, without warning, the rustling stopped. Silence. And then, hoofbeats. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the night. But they weren't coming from the tracks in front of him. They were coming from behind him. Luther turned sharply, raising his rifle, but there was nothing there. Just the empty barn, the swaying doors, and the wind whispering through the rafters. His pulse was a hammer in his chest, his mind racing. He had followed the tracks leading away from the barn. But if Salem was out there, then what the hell was standing behind him just now? Luther's breath came slow and steady, but his fingers tightened around the rifle. He wasn't the kind of man to scare easy. He had spent his whole life working under the open sky, facing storms, wild animals, and men far more dangerous than either. But this was different. The night had a weight to it, a thick, pressing stillness that wrapped around him like unseen hands. It wasn't just that Salem was gone. It was that something had been standing behind him just seconds ago, and now it wasn't. His eyes flicked back to the tracks leading into the trees. He had two choices: go back inside and pretend none of this was happening, or keep walking. Luther had never been the kind of man to turn his back on a problem. So he adjusted his grip on the rifle, squared his shoulders, and stepped forward. The wind had died completely now, leaving only the sound of his boots against the dirt. Each step felt heavier than the last. He reached the tree lean, pausing at the first twisted branch. The tracks continued inside, but now they were harder to see, swallowed by dead leaves and shadows. Luther swallowed. He knew these woods, had ridden through them since he was a boy. But now, staring into the blackness between the trees, he didn't recognize them at all. The air was different, carrying a faint metallic scent, something like rust or blood. A twig snapped. Luther spun, raising the rifle, his pulse hammering in his ears. The sound had come from somewhere deeper in the trees. He held his breath, waiting, listening. Then, another noise, a slow exhale. Low, heavy. Too big to be a deer. Too deliberate to be the wind. He wasn't alone out here. And then he saw them. Eyes. Just beyond the reach of the moonlight, barely visible between the branches, two glowing amber eyes staring back at him. They weren't frightened. They weren't wild. They were steady, unblinking, watching. And for the first time in a long, long time, Luther Graves felt something cold curl deep in his gut. He had made a mistake bringing that horse home. Luther's breath came slow and steady, but his muscles were tight, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. Yet, he didn't. He stood there, rifle raised, eyes locked on the pair of glowing amber eyes in the darkness. They didn't move. They didn't blink. They just watched. And there was something deeply, horribly wrong about them. He had tracked Salem here, followed the hoofprints straight into the woods. But the deeper he went, the more the tracks had changed, growing longer, sharper, pressing too deep into the earth. Now, staring into the trees, Luther couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was standing there wasn't the same horse he had brought home. A gust of wind rushed through the trees, carrying the unmistakable scent of blood. Fresh. Luther swallowed, forcing himself to take a step closer. He could see more now, Salem's outline, his powerful frame half hidden by the shadows. But something about the way he stood was wrong. His head was low, his muscles coiled, his breath slow and deliberate. Not like a spooked horse. Not like any horse at all. The barn lantern had cast strange shadows on him before, but now, under the moonlight, Luther could see the real shape of him. The legs were just a little too long, the joints bending in a way they shouldn't. His shoulders were broader, his chest deeper, and the way he held himself, not like prey, but like a predator. Luther clenched his jaw and adjusted his grip on the rifle. He wasn't the type to scare easy, but something about this felt old. Ancient. Like he had stumbled into something that had been waiting here long before him. Before his ranch, before any of this land had ever belonged to men. His mouth was dry, but he forced the words out anyway. Easy now. Salem took a step forward. The hoof hit the ground with a sickening weight, heavier than it should have been. The sound echoed, like something deep beneath the earth had shifted. Luther felt the vibrations crawl up his legs, rattling his bones. His gut twisted. That wasn't a normal step. Then, Salem lifted his head, his glowing eyes still locked on Luther's. And in the dead silence of the woods, the horse finally made a sound. A laugh. It wasn't a snort. It wasn't a whinny. It was low, guttural, wrong. A sound that didn't belong to any animal Luther had ever heard. It sent ice down his spine, his hands tightening around the rifle. And then, in a voice just above a whisper, so low Luther almost thought he imagined it, Salem spoke. Luther's breath came slow, controlled, but his pulse pounded so hard he swore he could hear it. His rifle was raised, his grip locked so tight his fingers had gone numb. It didn't matter. A gun wasn't going to help him now. He knew that in his gut, the same way he had known, from the very beginning, that there was something wrong with Salem. He just hadn't wanted to admit it. The horse, or whatever the hell stood before him, watched him in eerie silence. Those amber eyes burned in the darkness, the only source of light in the void of the trees. They weren't frightened. They weren't wild. They were patient. The way a man watches a coyote caught in a trap, knowing there's only one way the night is going to end. Luther felt it now, the weight of that gaze pressing down on him, making his chest tighten, his throat go dry. This wasn't an animal. This was something older. Something worse. Then, Salem spoke again. His voice was low, quiet, almost amused. You knew. Luther's stomach twisted. Because it was true. He had known. Maybe not in words, maybe not in thoughts, but in that deep animal part of his brain that had screamed at him the second he saw that horse in the auction ring. He had ignored the instinct. He had ignored the way the other men had stayed quiet, the way the air had felt too heavy when he raised his hand to bid. He had ignored the way Salem had looked at him, the way he had accepted being bought. Like it had been a choice, not a fate. Like Salem had been waiting for him. The trees around them felt smaller now, the darkness deeper. The air was thick, pressing against Luther's skin like an unseen hand. The rifle in his grip felt useless, heavy, meaningless. His feet felt rooted in place, like the earth itself had decided he wasn't going anywhere. Then Salem moved. Not fast. Not aggressive. Just one slow, deliberate step forward. His hooves sank into the dirt, too deep, like the earth itself was pulling him down. His body was shifting, subtly, the lines of his form stretching, bending in ways that a horse's body should not move. Luther's chest clenched. He had seen 1,000 animals move in his lifetime, but this wasn't movement. This was transformation. And as the thing wearing Salem's skin took another step, Luther finally understood. Salem hadn't come to him by accident. Salem had chosen him. Luther's breath came in shallow bursts, but he didn't dare move. The trees around him seemed taller now, stretching endlessly into the black sky, their twisted branches blocking out any trace of the stars. The air had changed, thicker, heavier, almost alive. It pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe, like he had wandered somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. Somewhere that wasn't meant for men. And Salem was still watching him. His body still resembled a horse, but only in the vaguest sense. His legs were stretched just a little too long, his hooves sinking too deep into the earth, as if the ground itself was giving way beneath him. His breath came slow and even, curling in the cold night air. But it wasn't the shape of him that made Luther's stomach twist. It was the way he stood, not as an animal, not as prey, but as something that knew exactly what it was. Luther tightened his grip on the rifle, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't help. Maybe it never would have. "What the hell are you?" he muttered, his voice rough and barely above a whisper. Salem blinked, his glowing amber eyes unblinking, unwavering. And then, with that same low, unnatural voice, he spoke again. "You already know." The words sent a chill through Luther's bones, even though he did know. Not in the way a man understands things logically, but in the way that something deep, something primal in his gut had been screaming at him from the start. He had heard stories before, whispers between old cowboys, tales that weren't supposed to be real. Stories about things that walked this land long before men came and claimed it as their own. About things that took shapes they weren't meant to take. He had never believed those stories. But he did now. A gust of wind rushed through the clearing, carrying the sharp scent of blood and earth, and the trees groaned under the weight of something unseen. The rifle in Luther's hands felt useless, heavy. The weight of realization settled deep in his chest. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to see this. And yet, Salem had let him. Luther's stomach twisted. This wasn't a mistake. Salem had come for him. The night had swallowed everything. The trees, the sky, even the ground beneath Luther's boots felt less real, like the world itself had begun to unravel. He wanted to move. God, he wanted to run, but it was as if something held him in place, something ancient and unseen. Salem no longer looked like a horse. Not completely. His body was stretched, distorted, as if shifting between forms, caught between something that once belonged to this world and something that never should have. And those amber eyes never blinked. Luther's breath came in short, sharp gasps. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of blood and earth. Salem stepped closer, and beneath his hooves, the ground sank, cracked, twisted. The rifle in Luther's grip suddenly felt meaningless, like a useless piece of wood in his hands. Deep in his gut, he knew, a bullet wouldn't change a damn thing. Maybe nothing could. Maybe nothing ever could. Then Salem spoke again. And this time, it was not a whisper. It was always going to be you. The words rattled through Luther's bones, deeper than sound, deeper than thought. It was a truth that had always existed, waiting for him to understand. The wind howled around him, the trees groaning like they were alive, their twisted limbs pulling back, creating an open space. The stars above flickered, then blinked out entirely. Salem took one last step forward, and the ground vanished beneath Luther's feet. His knees buckled. His body collapsed. Not from exhaustion, not from fear, but because something was taking him. He felt himself being pulled down, not by gravity, not by force, but by something deeper, something older, something that had finally claimed him. The last thing he saw was Salem, lowering his head, those burning, endless eyes locking onto his. Then, nothing. No sound. No light. No Luther. Only silence. Only emptiness. And when the wind finally settled and the world stood still again, there was nothing left in the clearing. Nothing but a single set of hoofprints, leading back toward the ranch.